Awesome.
Yep. Thanks everyone for joining in. I know it's Saturday and it's Saturday evening, but like everybody just jumped in. And thank you very much, Jono, for for agreeing and then giving us this talk. And a quick couple of quick announcements before we start. So since this is going to be an online meeting, we would go ahead with the presentation first. And if you have any questions, you can just post them in chat. And then just make sure that you're muted when you're not talking, so that it's because since there are going to be like a lot of people, I think it would be better if all of us mute ourselves. And if you have any questions, as I said, just post in the chat, and after the session we would get those things answered. And yep, I think we are good. So welcome, Jono. Thanks for agreeing. As I said, thanks for agreeing to give this talk. For everybody else, Jono is a web strategist and a full stack developer at Yoast, and he is going to today talk about the power of schema and structured data, and like how you can leverage that for your websites. And the floor is all yours, Jono, now.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. Oh, I've just tried to share my screen and it says that host disabled participant screen sharing. It's already gone horribly wrong.
Just give me 1 minute and I should.
Where are you based, Jono?
So I'm based in the UK. I work mostly from home in York, which is lovely. But Yoast, who I work for, is based in the Netherlands, in a tiny little town called Viken, which is almost on the German border, where most of the rest of Yoast is. So I'm our token British ambassador, I think.
Ah, nice.
Right, let's try that screen share again. There we go.
Yep. You should be able to share now.
Awesome. And let's do a screen 2. Oh, screen 1 even. Awesome. So in theory, everyone should now be able to see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Yep.
Cool. Okay, let's jump in then. So I think we've got 45 minutes-ish and then 15 minutes-ish of Q&A. That should give us loads of space to play with. So
yep.
Let's set the scene before we get too far in. I am a search engine optimization SEO nerd. I think that search is hugely interesting and exciting from a technical perspective, from a marketing perspective, but most importantly, from a consumer perspective. Search is fundamentally a huge part of how consumers discover and choose brands and products, and how they make decisions about which of those brands and products they want to pick. Because it's a huge part of where we as individuals choose to spend our time and money, it's very much driven by commercial forces. The search engine optimization landscape, Google, what you see, how it works, is driven by the flow of money. I think that makes it a really interesting competitive field to play in and explore, which is why for the last 2.5 years or so, I've worked for a company called Yoast, who hopefully all of you have heard of, best known for our SEO plugin, obviously for WordPress, which is currently running on somewhere like 11 million websites. But we do a lot more than that. We do a ton of stuff with the open web in general. We've got software for other platforms. We do bits of SEO consultancy. Why is that relevant? Because I really like the technical SEO side. I am fascinated by fixing and improving and optimizing website architecture, code, performance, because that sort of thing tends to deliver ridiculously outsized results. So I spend a lot of time looking at how websites are built, how they work, how themes interact with plugins, and that sort of thing. As well as that, and then just to set the scene, I am a digital marketing strategist and a consultant, and I've been lucky enough to work with some of the biggest companies in the world, trying to work out what their long-term strategies and direction is when it comes to SEO and digital marketing. However, I come from some very humble beginnings. This is a photo of me in 2011 at the very first kind of major conference that I spoke at, and that's nearly 10 years ago. At the time, I was an SEO manager in a digital marketing agency in Leeds in the UK. Why is this interesting? Because I recently found the footage and the slides from that event, and I watched it back. And unlike many things in SEO from 10 years ago, it was still surprisingly relevant. See, I'm talking about the importance of structured data and of schema.org in particular. If you're not familiar, you will be soon. At the time, the schema.org website had just launched, which was a collaboration between Google, Bing, Yahoo, and Yandex. It essentially defined methods, a form of language, which developers could use to structure and describe their content in great detail. So rather than just having a web page about my products or services or recipes, I could write structured data to describe the specific attributes of those things in a way that search engines, Google, Yahoo, and so on, could specifically understand. So things like prices, ingredients, a company's opening hours, the dimensions of images, the names and identities of authors of content. Suddenly we can describe all of these things and the relationships between them. So back in 2011, in my conference talk, I explained how if we implemented some of those new technologies on our websites, we could help search engines to better understand our content, which in turn would lead to richer search engine listings, better rankings, all sorts of competitive advantages. It would open up new possibilities for the future of the web and all sorts of exciting things. However, as the years went by, not many people took advantage of schema.org. You see, it was complex to understand, it was difficult to write, it was hard to manage, and the code itself frequently broke as you updated your content or website or themes or added and changed plugins. It all became unstitched. To get it right required extra work and input from developers at all sorts of stages in the content production process. It was really hard to do. And even though there were some rewards from the search engines from implementing them, they often weren't worth the trouble and time and cost of all this extra engineering. Today, 10 years or so later, schema.org and the standards around it has matured a lot, and Google and Bing and others are pushing really hard for individual websites, developers, business owners to adopt. A lot of what's driven that is that the coding standards and approaches for writing this kind of structured data have evolved. It's much easier to write and maintain structured data than it used to be. In particular, it's now primarily authored in JSON-LD, blobs of discrete JavaScript, rather than it being tied to all the individual HTML markup of the page. Historically, you would use microformats and microdata, which meant adding lots of classes and definitions to your span tags and your title tags and things. All of that was very fragile. Now you have a separate section of the page. You can just about see the example code on the left there, where you're outputting a description of all the things on that page in a lump of JavaScript. And in this example, we're describing a product that has attributes like a cost and reviews and a brand. And you can see how Google can take that understanding and use it to deliver things like rich results in the search engines, which obviously leads to higher click-through rate and visits and rankings, and things like star ratings and intelligent images, all these next generation features. You see, the reason Google really wants us to adopt schema.org so heavily is because it allows them to transfer their search engine results pages from what are generally just lists of links into things like this. The examples in the background are from an SEO tool called Systrix, who recently published some research where they'd found over 40 different types of search results, which aren't lists of links where a user chooses a result, but they are cards and tools and widgets and answers, interactive things. Now, for Google to provide these kinds of results, they need to do more than just crawl the web and extract the data they find. They need to understand the content they're consuming, and that understanding comes from schema.org markup. With me? So let's zoom out for a minute. Why is that? Fancier search engine results aren't Google's end game. This is a stepping stone in a much bigger strategy. They want to become, and they say this often, the Star Trek computer, where you ask Google a question or you pose it a problem and it just solves it intelligently. Where Google Assistant, the software that does all of this, whether it's on our phones, in our TVs, in a search box, in a browser, just solves those problems. Now, we don't have nearly enough time to explore the implications of that from a technical or socioeconomic perspective, but suffice to say that for now, to become that perfect personal assistant, Google needs more and better structured data. Okay, let's take a step back for a minute. I've talked about some technical stuff and some schema and things which most people who run sites or write content or even build themes and plugins probably aren't deeply familiar with. And that's a huge problem. And one of the things we've come to realize at Yoast, and me in particular, is that you shouldn't have to be an expert in all of this. To take advantage of the rewards that Google wants to give sites to implement this kind of code and to describe your content in a way they want, you shouldn't have to do and understand all this technical stuff. You see, the principle is that if you're an excellent baker, for example, you should be focusing on baking and on blogging about recipes and taking excellent photographs and improving your bread. You shouldn't have to also be worrying about your site's code and managing the intricate nuances of structured data. That is a dysfunction. Now, in order to address that, people turn to the plugin ecosystem and to themes which purport to have schema baked in. And there are a ton of schema plugins that let you add structured data to your pages. But In almost all of these, you have to manage your schema in addition to writing and managing your content, which means that more or less you have to maintain 2 versions of your page. And if those get out of sync, you risk being penalized by Google for misrepresenting your content. And often these plugins don't integrate very well in or out of your themes and your pages and each other. They produce bits of structured data. It's not universally good enough to support what Google needs. And even the Yoast plugin, when I started at Yoast, had the same problem. They didn't really solve the problem for you as well as we wanted. You ended up in a position where the user had to write a recipe in Classic Editor or Gutenberg or use a recipe plugin, and then also have a bunch of input fields to say how many calories was it, what are the steps in this. It's 2 sets of work, and frequently it goes stale or goes wrong. This is a huge problem. So in an ideal world, everybody takes advantage of this stuff, describes all their content, and we deliver a next generation of rich experiences on the web that improve how people search and interact, that surface the best possible products and services that make the world a better place. But that requires more complex, better, and more linked structured data. But neither content management systems, nor users, nor plugins to date can effectively deliver that. If you have enough size and budget and training and development resources, you can build and maintain your own schema solution. But that pushes small independent publishers and retailers out of the search results, which isn't a good thing. So if we rewind to November 2018, I set myself a challenge. I said, what I really want to do, so I'll brief sidestep. Part of my job at Yoast is to do research and development, to think about the future, and to scope and solve tomorrow's problems. So what I sat down in last November before last and said was, how do we enable, skipping, my slides aren't working, that's frustrating. Oh, there we go. How do we enable everybody to have rich graphs of schema data which represent their content, their business, their products? How do we do all of that automatically, invisibly, and perfectly based just on the content that users input? So if a baker is writing a recipe about their bread, they don't also have to define all the schema, they just write the recipe. And I think more importantly, how do we define an approach and a solution to all of these problems that's bigger than just Yoast and bigger than WordPress? How do we solve these conceptual problems and enable everybody to access this? How do we democratize structured data? There is a much longer version of this deck where I explain many of the mechanisms we went through to achieve this, but for the purposes of today, what I want to talk about is something a bit different. The short story is, I think we've done that. And I apologize, I know we're playing within WordCamp rules, which means we're not really meant to talk about and showcase brand stuff a lot, but what I'm going to show you is a lot of code and stuff that the Yoast plugin outputs. That's not a pitch for Yoast. I'm not saying that Yoast is the perfect and only solution. In fact, I'll show you some other approaches you can do to some approach you can use to do this sort of stuff. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to show you some Yoast stuff. What we're doing is this. And this is again, this is the shortcut. I've skipped a whole bunch of stuff. But for me, this is the exemplification of code is poetry. This is beautiful and it's descriptive and it's rich. What we're doing is on the left, you can see the JSON LD code that we're outputting. And this is on an article page on Yoast.com. And on the right, you can see Google's structured data testing tool parsing that and showing us what it can find. And just look at the depth. This is just an article on a WordPress site. And we have information about the web page, the organization who published it, the author who wrote the article, the size and dimensions of the image of that author, the breadcrumb structure, the relationships between the page, the relationship between the logo of the publisher and of the website, all of these things. It's enormously dense. This conveys meaning to search engines far more deeply and far more specifically than them just crawling and scraping a page full of words can. You start to get the idea of how this layer sits underneath the template and the content and provides Google with explicit information about what this page is about and what it contains. And that's just the passive stuff in the background. That's not the content layer. So that happens automatically with the structure in the background. What I think is even more interesting on top of that is as we start to play with Gutenberg and as the block editor evolves as a standard, we're starting to launch blocks which add to and stitch into and enrich that foundational schema stuff just through the act of writing. This is an example of our how-to block, which is just a Gutenberg set of blocks and rules, which allows you to define a set of how-tos. And how-to is a step 1, bake the cake, step 2, eat the cake. There's nothing special about the interface, but behind the scenes, we translate that into how-to schema that then integrates with the rest of the page's schema. And now Google can look at this page and say, okay, this is a web page that contains an article that contains a how-to guide written by Jono, who's an employee of an organization who has this logo. You start to see how all this stitches together. Incidentally, we're already seeing other people starting to build on this and integrate with this. It's really cool. And this is what happens. So on the left, you can see an example of a how-to guide saying how to write a how-to guide. It's getting a bit recursive. And on the right, Google has taken that and they've put it directly in the search results. Think about the difference in real estate and marketing value and clicks and visibility that drives. And until recently, this was only on mobile. As of last week, they're doing this on desktop too. It's not quite pretty yet in places, but you start to see conventional content and content without this kind of markup just isn't going to be able to compete. And we've had these kinds of capabilities for 10 years, but it's not really been this well rewarded or this easy to do yet. The principle behind our approach, and this is where you can start, if you want to start doing some of this yourself and start understanding it, this is the kind of learning, is that we take what we call a base script and we extend it. Every page on a WordPress website has 3 things in common. It is a website, you're on a web page, and that's published by an organization. And you can just about see here, on the left, we have that base script that describes the core structure of the graph. And on the right, you can see where we're cross-referencing things by their ID. Every one of these entities has a unique identifier. And when we say this identifier is the same as that identifier, we can start to build those relationships. We're defining a graph database in the page. Again, in the Yoast stuff, this is all automatic based on what we know about the site and the product and the content. And we support that for most content types out the box, as well as products, local businesses, and so on. What I think is particularly interesting for you lot is that if you're developing themes or plugins or websites, we have documented all of this. As I said at the beginning, the problem we wanted to solve wasn't how do we do some Yoast schema stuff, it's how do we define a standard for schema that everybody can adopt. I have spent countless hours documenting and open sourcing and writing all of this up. We have pages and pages. This is on developer.yoast.com. There's a section in the sidebar for schema. There are pages and pages that describe the approach. Not only the technical elements of the approach, but also the philosophy, the considerations, the backgrounds, the integrations, all of that. It's enormous. All of the nuance around how each individual bit of schema behaves and the business logic and content logic that determines how and when it should be populated is there. You can see in the example, if we're talking about a person who might be an author of a piece of content, all of the things that person needs to be described, all of the relationships between them. And also all of the awkward edge cases, like what happens if I have an article written by a person who doesn't have an avatar? Is it okay to use the publisher's logo as a fallback? And if not, how should that be? All of those considerations have been defined and described. That means that other people, other systems, other software, other themes, other plugins can take and either build their own version of this and just implement this, or they can take the work we've already done and build on it and extend it. This is open source schema, and I would love all of you to play with it. We also have an API if you're running Yoast in the site. We have an API that allows you to take our output and adapt it. So we do a really good job of getting the basics and the foundations right with defaults. But when you're running on 11 million websites, the defaults have to be fairly conservative. Obviously, there'll be many people with many sites where you want to say, actually, it makes more sense for my site to do this thing differently. Our API is really easy to use. It's really well documented in the same place. And you can say, that thing that you said is a how-to page, actually on our site should be an FAQ page, or should be a medical advice page, or this person shouldn't be output in this scenario. It makes it trivially easy to extend and adapt. That's really cool. So that was step one. There's lots more to come. We're still iterating. I think the thing I'm really excited about when I talk to people like you is I really want to see other people starting to build on this and adapt it, because we're also working on adding support for more schema types, on documenting edge cases, on integrating with other vendors like WooCommerce. We also work quite closely with some of the teams at Google on this. We go back and forth as we collaborate on some of their approaches. We tend to get early access to some of the new schema, and we help them define the standards, which is awesome. We're also working on expanding this beyond WordPress into Typo 3, some other places. I'm really excited about the kinds of new systems and services and things that we can create with this. We're already seeing other plugin developers and theme developers, some examples here, talking about how easy it is to take the foundation that we've built and to either modify that themselves or to extend and build into it. I would love to see more of that out in the wild. There is tons more of this stuff to come. So we have a roadmap that's long of all the stuff I want to build and add to this, which will support more stuff automatically, but also add more API hooks, more capabilities for theme developers, plugin developers, site developers, and so on. One of the things that's particularly interesting in this world, I think, is that it allows us to build new types of services and systems and products. I didn't have a slide for it because it's quite launched recently. Was a bunch of APIs in Yoast which allow you to extract and get all of this schema information. That means it's really easy to do things like build a schema search engine or build a system that extracts content from multiple websites, because all these descriptions are suddenly consistent. If I say, I want to build a website that lists all of the opening hours of all of the restaurants in New York that sell fish, that's really hard. Now it's really easy because all of that data is literally in their pages and structured and extractable and consumable. If you know which the URLs you want to get them from, you have a predictable model for what that data looks like. That enables new apps, new Internet of Things concepts, new machine learning capabilities, new types of websites and affiliate models, new types of structured data. And that's already running on 11 million websites. We need people to start taking advantage of that and doing cool stuff with it. From a WordPress perspective, I think it also means that we need to start thinking of units smaller than pages. What do I mean? At the moment, all of Google's paradigm and all of our way of thinking in WordPress is that a post is the smallest unit of thing. And it maybe has post meta and content, but that's really the smallest unit of content. When we start looking at schema, a post might contain a guide and a recipe by an author with relationships to other authors. And all. These are all things that are smaller than posts. And if we want to start interacting with those and integrating them and building them into our systems, we need to start thinking about WordPress from the perspective of units and units of schema and entities rather than just pages. Pages are a thing where those entities live, but they're no longer the unit that we ought to be working in. So that's all theory. Let's talk about some practical stuff. I think I'm about good for time, I think. The question then is, what can you do? And what immediate advantages can you get from this, and what practical, tactical stuff? That's quite a hard question, because if we've solved this for you and for everyone else, why is there any point in you learning this or caring about it? Well, the answer is because, as I've said, what we've done so far is literally just the foundations. We've built the basics. And there's a ton of stuff that you can do on top of that to use for immediate competitive advantage. Whether you're a site owner or a plugin developer or a theme reviewer, you can go further than just this foundation. So how does that work? I want you to build a mental model. Think about Wikipedia. Picture it in your mind. From an SEO perspective, Wikipedia has a kind of special standing. It has a special place in the SEO world because it's generally considered to be the authority. It's the most important website there is. Its articles are the most authoritative. And if you ignore for a moment some of the challenges they have with editorial processes and politics, their articles are often the most trustworthy articles on the web. Its content, in most cases, is written and edited by the foremost experts on their subjects. And that means that Google uses Wikipedia as a resource. It means that SEOs, marketers, PRs, brand managers, consumers trust Wikipedia content, and they value links from it, and they believe that it's authoritative. And as we know that Google is getting more and more focused on and finds more important the concepts of expertise, authority, and trust, there are few examples as good as Wikipedia. We often think about it as the king of websites. What if, and bear with me, what if Wikipedia isn't special at all? What if it doesn't have any special place in Google's algorithm? What if links from Wikipedia and its content aren't magically better than any other site? What if Wikipedia is just another website? What if it's no different from your website? What if it's as well regarded as it is, not because of some indefinable differentness, but just because it's full of expertly written, authoritative, trustworthy content? You could argue maybe that that's the same case for many websites. Your own website maybe has some of those attributes, but it doesn't get as much traffic or exposure as Wikipedia. So what makes Wikipedia different? Aside from the fact that they've been around for a while and they've got some scale, what makes them special? What can we learn for our sites and content and development from Wikipedia to achieve that same level of specialness? The thing that makes it different is how it's structured. They don't have a top navigation across the top of the page, which sends you to categories which you have to wade through to find what you're looking for. They don't have tons and tons of paginated blog posts or products which you have to crawl through and pick from. What they do have is a web of interconnected content which cross-references each other and everything everywhere, which is written by trusted expert authors. That's a knowledge graph. And it means that every article they add, every new thing that they add or increase, say if they add an article about me, becomes easily connected to content about SEO and digital marketing and ginger hair and other things I'm connected to. Each page on that site is a node in a web of expertise and not just an article on a website, which means that every article they add and enhance makes the whole site more useful and relevant and trustworthy. What they've done is described a resource, a data set, not just a web page. Because all those connected concepts are connected, they are more authoritative and trustworthy. Imagine if you had that kind of structure on your website, if you were a web of things which Google could understand. Now, let's be realistic. You're never going to have the millions of pages that Wikipedia has. And you're never going to interconnect your article about the green widgets you sell with one about particle physics because you don't have that breadth or depth of content. And if you do have that kind of scale of content, chances are that's probably not expertly written or authoritative and trustworthy, and you have other challenges. But what you can do is describe the things on your website in the same way that Wikipedia structures its articles. You can connect the information about the product you sell to the company who sells it, to the information about who wrote that content, to the person's own Twitter profiles, and so on and so forth. You can use structured data and schema.org to describe the content and the entities you reference and their relationships. You can start to think, how would I structure my site's content or my plugin outputs content and its data as if it were pages on Wikipedia? Think about how Wikipedia uses internal links to cross-reference entities. Think about how they add detailed data, facts and figures in those side tables to answer questions and specifically answer questions and expose key answers. Think about how they compete by having and exposing data that nobody else outputs. And think about how that data has its own metadata. When was this created? When was it last updated? Who edited it? What's the word count? What's the estimated reading time? What language is it in? And so on. Think about how they structure all of their content and articles with clear sections, and how they use and often need citations to prove their expertise and authority of any claims. Think about how they're expertly reviewed and challenged and continually updated. You can do all of this in content, on pages, in plugins, in themes, with your website in structured data. This is what that starts to look like. This is a tool called classyschema.org. It's really cool, by a guy called Tony McCreed. It takes schema.org JSON blobs like the ones I've shown you, Yoast outputs, and visualizes them. On the left, you can see some schema code. And on the right, you can see how that outputs. Here we're describing a recipe in a web page on a website. And this is a really simplified example, but you can start to see how that recipe connects to an article and the web page and the organization, how in turn those connect to other nodes. Imagine how much more dense these relationships would be if you also described the chef and the book that he's selling and each review of that book and the author of each of those reviews and the opening hour of his restaurant and the dishes on the menu and the links into the apps where you can order them. All of these things you can do in Schema really easily. You go to schema.org, you look up the names of the properties of the things you want to describe, and you just add the JSON output into these blobs. This is technically child's play, but the implications are huge. If you take this to extremes, you might end up with pages that the data looks something more like this. This is the top 2,500 pages on Wikipedia and their relationships. I'm not saying you should add thousands of pages. I'm saying that if you start to think of Wikipedia not as pages, but as a collection of authoritative data, this is what you want to be achieving. This is a network describing the relationships between entities. You can't do that with pages, at least not easily. But you can do it with data on your pages. Google rewards expertise, authority, and trust. But they only want to return results sites. They only want to return results from sites which are trustworthy, which are good, which they can understand are trustworthy. How do you validate that your content is expert and authoritative and trustworthy? Well, I want to show you a bit of research. This was from last year from two companies, SparkToro and JumpShot. It collected data from a wide variety of users, and it showed that 50% of all searches on Google don't result in a click. And the thinking is that in the majority of cases, that's because those people's questions have been answered in the search results. somebody has typed something in and they've got their result without having to visit a website. That's because increasingly, as I've shown you, their search results look something like this. Not a list of blue links that you have to pick from, not even the featured snippets that everybody chases and those top answer boxes, but a myriad formats and resources and tools and widgets. In many of these, Google has extracted the content of the pages that they've crawled and presented them in a dedicated format. Critically, it's only going to be doing this when it can extract content from pages that it believes to be experts and authorities and trustworthy. And it will do that by evaluating, do that in part at least, by evaluating the structured data on the page. So if you're building a website or running content or developing a recipe plugin, if you're not outputting your data in structured data in this kind of schema approach, Google is less likely to trust it and understand it and less likely to use it. And that means that the users of that website, of that business, will never get to that website because they're not going to find that content in the search results. So you need to be offering up all of your information in a format that they can understand and utilize. This is happening in B2B, in B2C, in cars, in recipes, in every industry you can imagine. This is the future of how we browse and consume content. It's critically important because when you look at where these kinds of rich listings occur, it's for when people are searching for information and for trust. This is a study from an SEO tool called Ahrefs. They list the kind of searches where these rich snippets and results appear. When you look at the words that they occur on, these are people starting their journeys. They're people starting to look for trustworthy, authority, expert content. People who have questions, who are researching. They use words like best, versus, can, top. These aren't people who have picked what they want to buy and are right at the end of a purchase funnel. These are people who are starting to think about how they might solve their problems. And if the website you're managing or optimizing or running your code on isn't showing up in these scenarios, it will never be seen by visitors. That's quite scary to think about. So what do we do? Let's look for some specifics. The first thing you do is you have to have a robust foundation. It's not enough just to put bits of schema onto a page. You have to describe a rich structured graph like this one. You have to define the relationships between all of these things, between your content, your web pages, your website. If you don't do this, you're stuck just mentioning things that exist on a page. Yes, you absolutely can just output a bit of recipe schema on a page, but then you're just saying, here is a recipe. You're not demonstrating that it was written by somebody who knows about recipes. You're not demonstrating the connection between that recipe and the page it's on and the business who runs it, etc., etc. Remember, we're trying to structure our content in the same way that Wikipedia structures their website. So each individual connected piece strengthens the whole. If you're on WordPress, obviously, you can do this sort of stuff really easily by building on the Yoast plugin. If you're not running Yoast or you're looking at other platforms, you can go to schemaapp.com and use their system, but you'll need to customize the output a bit. If you're really desperate to do this by hand or via something like Google Tag Manager or JavaScript, I strongly recommend against that approach unless you have any other option. It's really hard to scale this level of detail, but you can write this from scratch if you want to. It might be good as a learning experience. And then go and learn how this all integrates and interacts. So again, I've solved all of this with the documentation. You don't have to worry about, if it's a Tuesday and our product delivery times, all of the business context and scenarios of how these bits of schema interoperate is all documented and defined. You can take the Yoast approach and do your own approach with it and build on that from our documentation. It's really cool. The secret and the key is to represent everything. Take a look at your content. This is a screenshot of the top half of an article on Yoast.com. You can see each of those red boxes where I've outlined something is something which we're explicitly describing in schema. The breadcrumb navigation, the name of the article, the logo of the website, the name of the author, description of the author, their relationship to the content itself, the hero image. All of these are things, the search functionality, the page, all of that. Many of the pages that you're outputting code on or that you're producing or managing have these kinds of details, and it's really important that you describe those to Google. There's less obvious stuff as well, things like videos, data sets, tables of information. If you're outputting tabular data, that sort of stuff is really good for schema. And quite often, chances are that websites and businesses have things that they're not exposing. The content itself, the information about the organization and their people, the metadata around all of this. When was this table last updated? What is the file format of this image? All of this kind of information can be output. If you want to get an advantage and get ahead of the game, start looking at competing on and exposing the stuff that nobody else really is yet. There are properties here that you can just about see in the image where, let's say a person, you can describe a person in schema, and most people go, what is their name, what is their bio? You can also say, what is their height? Who were their parents? Which university did they go to? What's their job title? What's their Twitter profile? All of these things you can define, and then Google can better understand it and use it to reward those pages. Most web pages are fairly generic, but there are specific subtypes of web page. This is an item page. This is an about page. These are specific definitions that you can use. Again, all of this is documented in schema.org. You can go and read through and find out where you have stuff. Not this is an organization, but this is a museum or a dentist, or maybe both. I can't imagine many museum dentist overlaps, but maybe it exists. You can define all this sort of stuff. If you want to get really ahead of the game and you really want to beat competitors and other sites and plugins to the long-term stuff, this is a screenshot from pending.schema.org. This is like the beta staging ground for future schema properties. This is stuff that almost definitely will arrive in schema but isn't ready yet. Consider for a moment that most of schema.org is run and resourced and written by Google employees, or people who are 2 degrees of separation from Google. This is Google's pipeline for features they want to support. If I had to guess, looking at this screenshot of things which are coming up, Google may be about to launch something in the property market. They're trying to describe the number of bedrooms a house has. And something in the health market, what are these symptoms? If I have a plugin that's designed to sell real estate or rentals, A, that's going to disrupt my marketplace, and B, I ought to really prioritize getting on top of the describing my content in a format they can understand. Maybe you have metadata in your sites and your products and your plugins which aligns to these kinds of things. Maybe you can get there before other people. We know that Google is particularly sensitive in categories around finance and health and well-being, so it's definitely worth looking in those areas for how do you make sure you're abiding by their rules. Otherwise, you might find yourself struggling. Now, if you really, really want to get out there, and I really shouldn't show you this because it's a little bit of a hidden secret, but it makes me so excited. This is a screenshot from the schema.org GitHub repository. So schema itself is an open source standard and is discussed and debated in GitHub. There are a huge, so you go here and you search all of the open issues for the word Google, and you find all of the things in schema.org as a standard itself that people from Google are working on or asking about and looking for. This is Google's explicit pipeline. This is stuff that is coming to Google in the future, or at least they're thinking about it and exploring it. Maybe you can align what you're doing with stuff with that. It's worth considering also that I've talked a lot about describing the stuff on your page and your site and your plugin. You can go further than that. And you can start to connect your schema graphs and descriptions to stuff on other pages, on other websites, people and pages that might be able to describe things in more depth than you can. You can use same as properties on your people, your organizations, your properties, to cross-reference to a more authoritative web page about your thing. Maybe Wikipedia, maybe a manufacturer of a part, maybe something else entirely. You can say this blue widget is the same as that Wikipedia page. And that might mean that other people are more likely to reference and cite your content and link back to you through schema, and that helps boost everybody's authority and trustworthiness in that space. Worth saying, though, very briefly, one of the things that's critical to do with all of this is not to overreach, is not to use schema.org to mark up and describe things you don't have, not to lie to Google about things like star reviews. There are so many cases where people say, yes, my product has 5,000 5-star reviews, when it obviously doesn't, and Google immediately comes along and slaps them down and says, you're no longer allowed schema.org markup. This is critically about describing the things that you do have and the properties of your page. That said, the other way around is true. It's worth saying your website has a whole bunch of information about the organization that you have to go away and find out or create or change in order to represent in schema. That might be a real competitive advantage. If you want to say, I want to make sure that Google thinks my authors are trustworthy, I should describe which universities they came from. You then need to have authors that came from prestigious universities. So maybe there are business processes that change around this in order to take advantage of the schema. That's a bit of a whole bunch of stuff to drop on you. So I'm going to wrap up with some things you can go away and look at to learn more. A reminder, this is all open source and you can get involved in all of this. So if you're interested in this and taking advantage of it, which I think you have to, otherwise the code you're outputting isn't going to turn up in Google. Definitely go look at schema.org and get a feel for the standards and the way that it works. If you want to start building on and expanding your plugins, your sites, your content, and you want to do that on top of the work we've already done, look at our developer documentation and either build on the Yoast plugin or take the principles and the approach and extend that. If you want to get ahead of the game, go look at the schema pending stuff. Look at all Google's documentation as well. There's a link there on the schema.org itself. Schema.org standard itself. Worth noting that if you operate in a space that isn't well represented in schema, like for example, there is no schema markup at the moment, no standard for animals. So if you're running a pet store, there is no schema that you can use. It's an open source standard. You can go in, you can look at what's already there, you can propose to extend it, to add new stuff. You can define the rules and get there before other people, which is obviously quite a nice thing to do as a business to get there first. That is it for me. Hopefully that wasn't too much of a deep dive and it was a useful starting point for you to go and do your own research. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, you want to build on the stuff we've done, you want to understand how it works, you want to do your own stuff. That is it for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jono. That I think it was a very wonderful session. I personally learned like a lot of things about schema and why it is so important. I think we will open up the floor for questions. There are already some questions on the chat. I'll probably read them for you.
Yeah, so I've got it open. That's cool.
Yep. So I think the first question was from Prem. Like basically, he's asking like now because of schema, right? Like all the changes that are coming in. Are the internal links that are going to happen within a site, like where you're going to link multiple things within the site, the internal links, are they going to now become much more valuable when compared to the external links from the importance?
That's a really interesting question. So I think internal links have always been valuable. I think they're really overlooked from an SEO perspective. I think making sure that you have a good site architecture and all your pages are connected and cross-reference is a good thing to do anyway, and is far more important than most people consider. From a schema perspective, yes. So there aren't many cases where in schema Google looks at the relationship between pages, but there are some. So I'm not allowed to talk about our Yoast roadmap, but I will break that rule just in this case. One of the things that's in our schema pipeline is describing archive page relationships better. So if you've got a WordPress taxonomy or a category page or something like that, there is schema where you can say, here are all the articles, all the posts returned in the query for this in a way that Google understands and can give you carousels. So at some point, hopefully that will turn up in Yoast. In the meantime, you want to be looking at Google's developer documentation for carousel schema. And you can say, here are all the important links on this page and help them understand that relationship. That can be really valuable. You get really rich search results for that, really common for things like this page lists 10 recipes and I want to see a carousel in the search result of all 10. It's really easy to implement.
Awesome. So the next question is like AK was asking like, the schema.org stuff, right? Is this like the next evolution of Spark or the RDF thing?
Yeah, it's very similar. So schema is like an abstraction on top of a whole bunch of this, like 10 layers below the schema.org standard. It's built on RDFA type stuff. This is a much cleaner, much more simple way of building it. But if you understand those principles, yes, it's almost exactly the same kind of thing, but with some nice comfy layers on top of it that make it easier A, for humans to parse and digest and write, and B, for systems like Google to do the same. So yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So the next question is basically like we have different schema types, right? So one is the article and the other one is the block schema. So from the schema perspective, like what are the major differences between these two?
This is such a good question, and it's one of the things that many people don't really understand about schema and don't get right. So I guess there's two parts to this answer. One is most people think about just web pages. And actually, there's much more nuance than that. So quite often, a post, for example, on WordPress will be an article within a web page. So there's two distinct entities there. So there's all these different types of things and their relationships. A blog posting, all one word for schema, is a type of article. So there's also this idea of more specific types of things. And you can even have a news posting article that is a more specific type of blog article that's a more specific type of article. And as you get deeper into those trees, sometimes you get more specific properties. So an example, an organization is pretty generic and it has a whole bunch of properties. A news organization also has additional properties for things like what's our diversity policy and what's our ethics policy and what's our editorial policies that you wouldn't have on a normal organization. So it's really good practice to find the most specific type of thing that you can use to represent your content and to use that. Now, one of the things I mentioned at the beginning, one of the challenges we have in Yoast is we have to be quite conservative with our defaults. If you've got 3 custom post types, we don't know really what they are. We know that they're articles because they're posts. We don't know if they're blog posts. So our defaults are pretty basic. If you want to say, I definitely know that my news custom post type is a news article, you can write 3 lines or so of PHP with our API and your functions files, and you can change that. And yet the more specific you get, the better, because Google's going to understand it, and you unlock more attributes to describe things. Hopefully that makes sense.
So the next question is from Raja. So he's basically saying, so we have rich snippets and schema, and he's also saying like these have been for a very long period of time. However, this has not been taken very seriously, right? So this is something that you covered at the beginning of the session. So is that due to the fact that it does not have greater impact on indexing, since most of the site manages to get better indexing without such schema structure?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, so it's never really impacted indexing, and it definitely doesn't directly impact ranking. But what's definitely changed in the last maybe 2 years or so is Google has started providing much bigger, better rewards for implementing it. Like in 2011, you got a few stars under your recipe. In 2020, you take up a whole mobile screen. So things like the click-through rate, the rich snippets, the size and impact of those is much bigger. You can skip the rankings entirely and the challenge of going from position 5 to 4 to 3 if you just have a rich snippet that comes straight in at first. So the rewards are much bigger. Not in conventional ranking terms or indexing terms, the rewards are much bigger. The other thing that's changed is that, well, that's a good question. What was the other thing? I definitely had 2 parts to this answer. So maybe not. Maybe that's the answer.
No, so the question is more like, is this because like obviously, like as you said, the schema and rich snippet have been there for quite some time, right? I mean, so the question is more about like, is this because since it doesn't have a greater impact on the indexing part, right? Obviously, like like when somebody is searching on Google, like this, how this search result is going to be presented, that is going to definitely be affected. But the actual fact that the indexing of the entire site is not going to be directly impacted by the presence or not the presence of schema inside the website, right? So the question is more about could that be one of the reasons why this hasn't taken up or like this hasn't become very popular?
Yeah, definitely. If you're trying to prioritize how do I get my site called an index, this isn't going to help you particularly. It might, as much as Google tend to try and follow things that look like links, but yeah, this wouldn't be something you'd use for that, for sure.
Okay, so the next question is, so basically this person is asking like, if I want to publish content which say something around how to calculate bandwidth of an antenna in a radio equipment site, how do I start? Like, so should I conform to schema.org standards?
Good question, nice and practical. So rewinding briefly, make sure you've got a strong foundation that describes the web page, the organization, and so on. And then this is really easy. That sounds like a how-to guide inside an article. So you have your article, which has an author and a published date and a URL, and then that has a property which is like has part or is main. There's various ways to connect it, which we describe in the standards. You say this is a how-to guide that has 6 steps. And step 1 is, and also you require these tools. So you're going to need a tape measure. You're going to need a glass of water, whatever. So yeah, you just describe that how-to guide using the schema.org standards, or much easier to get into, go look at our developer specs. We have a page for how-to guides that describes how to do it a bit more accessibly. Also, interestingly, I've just Googled quickly, and schema.org has a bunch of standards for things like radio broadcast service and radio channels. So if that antenna is related to radio services, you might also be able to connect those and describe it much more richly, which would be pretty cool.
Awesome. So the next question, which is also the question that I also had personally, is like in one of the slides you talked about the 0-click search result, right? I think it was very major. It's about 50%, right? So making the content available in schema format is definitely going to be helping Google, because they are going to be understanding the content much better and things like that. But from the web owner perspective, like the person who is responsible for the website, isn't it actually going to affect the traffic that we are going to get from Google?
Yes, this is a huge challenge, and nobody really has an answer, and it touches on legal challenges and privacy challenges, economic challenges. So the research shows, or at least suggests, and it depends whose research you look at, but already almost half of searches don't click on a website. And even some of those half we do are going on to click on Google websites like Google Maps and Google Flights. So we're already maybe losing over half of our traffic. The question is, what do you do about that? Because many of us have business models which rely on getting clicks to our sites, whether that's to get ad impressions or clicks, or to sell a thing, or to get signups for a service. If those people aren't getting to the site, what do you do? Nobody has an answer to this. Google doesn't have a good answer. The businesses who are pushing back and they don't have a good answer. The risk is if you say, I don't like this, I don't want to expose, I don't want to give my data to Google, and one of your competitors do, you're gone. Because your consumers don't even see your brand, never mind get to your website. So you have to play this game, which isn't great, because you want to try and build brand recognition and preference so that later on when people are thinking, okay, I'm at the point where I'm going to buy something, they remember the name of your website and they go to it directly, or you get a commercial page ranking. But yeah, this is really tough, especially sites who are more editorial, like news sites and publishers. Google is, in some regards, removing the incentive for them to publish. Why should I pay journalists to write content if I can't turn that back into money? And yeah, nobody has a really good answer to this. I know the people at Bing are working on the same challenges. There isn't a good answer other than you kind of just have to deal with it for now until somebody comes up with a new economic model for the web. Otherwise, you lose because your competitors take some market share. I think the best answer I can give, and it's really not a good one, is focus on building a brand, not focus on getting clicks to a website. How do you make people prefer and remember and choose your brand, not how do I get clicks to a website? That's hard. It's big, it's real world, it's scary, it requires budget and billboards. But yeah, otherwise we're all struggling, and everybody's struggling with this. So yeah, there's no answer yet, but hopefully the great, I should stop one thing. Part of the reason there's no answer to it is because much of the SEO industry is fighting against it, saying we don't like this, we don't want this, we want something else. Nobody has really said what that something else is. I think this industry is full of smart people, the WordPress people, the SEO people, everyone else around that. We can collectively come up with that answer and work out what it is, maybe. So if you're sat there thinking, I know what the solution to this is, I have a new economic model for the future of the web, please share it and tell the world, because yeah, it's going to be up to us to solve this.
So next question, I mean, I think like this also kind of reminds me, like, you know, when Google was just getting started, like probably like 2 decades ago, like there were a small moment where like people said, don't, index my content and things like that. This was like the very, very early stages of Google. I remember that moment where like, you know, a lot of people were saying like, you know, don't index my content, this is copyrighted and you should not show it in your website and things like that, which like very, very quickly, like, you know, people just stopped doing that because when they realized like how much more traffic that they can get from Google. I think like possibly like as time goes on, there might something like that might happen here as well. Okay, so moving on to the next question. So this person was asking, like, are there any schema defined for accessibility?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. You know, I don't know in detail. I know that you can define, you can provide a link to an accessibility feature. Here we go, I'm just pulling it up now. Yeah, so there is schema for describing an accessibility feature, but it's not very in-depth. Like this might apply to a website or a web page or an article. You can say, here is a link to an alternative version. Here is a button that sets low contrast mode. But yeah, this isn't really well built out. Maybe this is an area that if you are an accessibility expert, could do with a bit of work. I know there's obviously some really sophisticated stuff with error markup, but that's an entirely different standard to schema. Maybe they should be closer together and there should be a way to cross-relate them. A lot of the gaps in schema like that aren't for any good reason other than that nobody has really championed and pioneered them yet. So if there's somebody who wants to use that and it would improve their consumption of internet content, there's a good argument to get that defined and on the roadmap. Great question.
So next is a very interesting question. So basically, like, being Yoast is one of the very famous brand, right? And also it's been like, very famous plugins and things like that. So obviously with popularity, there's also going to be like a lot of people who are going to be like, basically they get into the mode where like if you kind of go and oppose the leader, like you kind of all get exposed, right? Like possibly because of that and possibly for other reasons. But so the question is around, so there are like plugins which are available in the WordPress plugin repository, which kind of claims to reduce the bloat that has been added by Yoast plugins on the site, right? What is your take on it? And is that really something that, or is there any, even a corner case scenario or like a very niche scenario where somebody has to consider those type of plugins?
The short answer is no, I don't think so. I think that they are, as you kind of hinted at, it's very easy to poke holes at the leading solution in the space and to make a name by making claims about it. Obviously, I'm biased, but I should say very clearly, I work at and for Yoast because I believe in the product. I'm where I am doing what I am because I'm an SEO expert. I love WordPress, I love Yoast, but I'm there because I believe. I guess two answers. One is bloat is a very easy word to use and very hard to define. The Yoast plugin does 1,000 things behind the scenes, 999 of which most users will never see or need to see. And part of our product philosophy is we fix all of that invisibly and we don't bother people with settings and overhead and craft. Like so much stuff that we do that people don't even understand. Some of that might be considered bloat. We add HTTP headers to your RSS feed to stop Google crawling it. That's a good SEO standard, but maybe you think you don't want that and maybe you think you know better. Like a big part of my job is I'm an SEO expert and I think that's worth doing and it's worth the cost. The challenge is that every one of those 1,000 features comes with a performance overhead because we're running code and there's no way to avoid that. And what we do to mitigate it, we have a team, we have like 100 plus people working from Yoast, and a big chunk of those are some of the world's best PHP developers. Our code is fast, our code is efficient, but it's still doing lots of stuff. And if you're finding plugins that claim to make it faster by turning things off and disabling it, that's because it's doing less stuff. And if you're running the plugin because you want to win on SEO, you need to be doing the SEO things. And whilst WordPress says it's quite good at SEO out the box, it's a 4 out of 10. Now, many other plugins were 2 out of, many other CMSs were 2 out of 10, so 4 is quite good. But we take it up to 10. You want to make it faster, you can turn some stuff off, but then you're doing less SEO. So yeah, it's kind of it's the challenge of running stuff takes cost performance, but not a ton. Like our 14.0 release, I think sped up most sites running Yoast by 10%, which is, look, when you think about the sheer impact of that, that's phenomenal. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about bloat.
Okay, thanks. And good to know that directly from you, right? I mean, that I think kind of gives more clarity and credibility to that. Okay, so the next question is also a very interesting question. So back in the days when SEO, was there and all things like that, so there used to be like a lot of these not so good practices, like where people try to game Google and game the system to get more ranking and things like that, right? Yep. And obviously Google was fighting really hard on it, and then was able to identify those sites and then penalize them and things like that. So do you see that kind of thing also happening in Schema? Because you also mentioned in one of your slides that don't over talk about, or if you don't have some data, don't expose that in Schema and then claim false data, right? Because obviously you mentioned that Google is going to penalize you. And in your experience, how how fast is Google, or is there a chance like somebody can actually get away by faking certain things in Schema as of now, or Google has been very strict on that?
So a bit of both. They are being very strict, but obviously it takes them time to spot and catch and understand when things aren't true. But that's the same with any web content. You could set up a website saying, we sell the best blue widgets in the world and we've got 1,000 5-star reviews and the Queen of England loves us. At some point, that's going to have legal or financial implications. Schema's not really that different. Yes, you can lie. You can cheat. You can say anything you want in schema. You can say, we are the biggest panda bear on the planet. And fine. At some point, Google will take issue with that. It's unclear how much of their analysis of schema is programmatic and how much of it is human review. But the areas where you would want to cheat, like reviews and citations and that sort of stuff, they are very strict on. And the way they typically respond is they just say, nope, this domain is no longer allowed reviews. And you burn stuff pretty quickly. Like with all SEO, I would never recommend taking those kind of shortcuts. It's almost always easier and better to do the right thing, because then you're also benefiting your consumers and your safety and a whole bunch of other things. Yeah, you can write whatever you want in schema and tell whatever story you like. But if it's not true at some point, that's going to stab you in the back.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. I think we are mostly done with all the questions. So I have a personal question for you.
Cool.
So I'm like recently working on a website where basically we have come up with some new definitions for certain words. Like, you know, for example, like they're actually like not just definitions, we're coming up with like really new concepts, right?
Oh, wow.
So, and this is something that we want to actually like put out to the world and then let them like, you know, make it available to the world and things like that. So what type of schema would you recommend for these type of things? Like basically,
that's a great question.
I wouldn't say it's like a glossary where you just define, you have a term and then give a definition, but it's also something like where you're actually introducing a completely new concept to an industry, like, you know, which no one is also not aware of, that kind of
That's really cool. I think that's something that happens in SEO occasionally as well, and I hadn't thought about, but this is something we should be doing as well. I've just pulled up a link for schema's defined term, which I think is the closest you can do to that. It's not the best, but you can at least say that this word is a thing and it has relationships to other things. One of the things I should have explained actually when I was talking about schema is that, so I mentioned that like blog post is a more specific type of article and that gets down a tree. You can also go up the tree. And that everything you describe is a type of thing. And that a thing is quite versatile. A thing can have a URL and a description and an about and some other stuff. So even if you're, things like this with defined term, where that might be a bit orphaned and a bit weird, it's still a thing. So you can also give it other types, an identifier, an image, a name. You can define these a little bit. So yeah, that'd be really cool.
Awesome.
Nice.
Thanks.
Good scenario.
Thanks, Jono. I'm just scrolling just to make sure we haven't missed any questions. I don't think we missed any.
Awesome.
And I also just realized that we are over by a couple of minutes and eating into your lunchtime.
No, it's fine.
So
Priority's fine.
Yeah, thanks for this wonderful session. I'm pretty sure like a lot of us like learned a lot of things, a lot of good things, a lot of new things, a lot of exciting things. And
awesome.
Thanks very much for the session and also patiently answering all our questions.
No, thanks to you for hosting and organizing and getting out there, and thanks everyone for turning up. It's Saturday evening for you, which is even worse than Saturday lunch. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you. See you all later. Have a good one.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.